Hello, welcome to PC Drills, where you find help on how to handle your PC related issues. Today we continue with our lesson 2 under the chapter of Algorithm and Programming Languages. Lesson 2, we are going to be talking about programming language translators. On our previous lesson, we showed you this diagram for programming software illustration. We said when you have a particular thing that you wish the computer to solve, you need to give it instructions, and when you are giving instructions, you write them on a source code editor and the computer runs it. So if you use the IDE software, so at this level where we have a compiler, when you write your code in the source code editor for the computer to understand it, it needs to be translated into the bytecode that the computer can understand. And at this level of translation, we have here a compiler. This compiler is simply one of the various options for translation that you might be using. So, and that is where our topic for today is mainly focused. So I said, when you write your source code for the program, you need to translate it into a way that the computer can understand by having the object code or the machine code. And to do that, you need a particular software or a particular tool called a language translator. A language translator can be any. It can be a compiler, it can be an interpreter, assembler, and so on. So a compiler here is just one of the various language translators you might have. And a particular language translator depends on where and which particular programming language are you using. So the objectives of this particular lesson is for you to know what are programming language translators, the different types of programming language translators, where they are applicable, and what's a source code, what's an object code. A computer is a useful tool for solving a great number of problems. To make a computer do anything, you have to write a computer algorithm and a program. So the main thing with a computer is that it is just solving problems depending on what set of instructions you have given it to work on. And for the computer to be able to work on those particular issues you are giving it, it should be in a way that the computer can understand. That is where you need a language translator. So for example, you might be speaking to someone who speaks English, or let's say you are the person who speaks English, the other person speaks French. You need to give that person instructions. You speak in English, but the other person cannot perform the instruction because the person cannot understand the English that you speak, but the person understands French. So you need maybe someone who speaks both languages, such that when you speak in English, it tells the person in the French that the person understands what the person can do or should do. That is exactly the same way it works with language translators. You write something the computer cannot understand, and for it to understand what you have written, it needs a particular tool that will translate it into the way that the computer can understand. That is the basic idea behind language translators. And for the language translators, you can have various types. You can have an interpreter, an assembler, and a compiler. These are the main three that you might have. And depending on the particular programming language, it determines which one here you are to work with. First, let's start with a compiler. A compiler is a programming language translator that translates high-level programming language source code into machine code. So when we say translating from high-level programming language into machine language, generally we know that in programming there are various levels of programming languages. You can have at the base that the computer understands, we have the machine language. Above the machine language, you have low-level programming languages. Low-level programming languages will be something like the assembly language and so on. Above the assembly language, you also have the high-level programming languages. And for examples of the high-level programming languages, you can have something like C, C++, Java, C#, Python, and the rest. So at this level, when we say the compiler translate high-level programming language into a machine language, it means that if you write a code in a high-level language, for you to be able to make the computer to be able to understand what you have written, you need to translate it with the help of a compiler. Next, we have an assembler. An assembler will simply say a programming language translator which translates a low-level programming language or assembly language source code into machine language. On this previous slide with this small sketch, for a compiler it's from high level to machine language, but meanwhile for an assembler we have instead from the low level language into the machine. So we are dealing with these last two at the bottom. Next we have the assembler and a compiler. The difference between both of them, I've separated them with this square. When you write your code in the assembly language, like on the left, when you write using assembly, you use an assembler to translate the code into a machine language readable code. And when you write it with a high level language, you will need but a compiler to be able to translate it. So if you are a programmer and you deal with either of these levels, whether the assembly language level or you are dealing with the high level language, for example C program, C++, Java, and many others, you're dealing with a high level language. If you don't really understand what we mean high level programming languages and low level programming languages, you can just do a quick search on that and you continue with the lesson. But it might be one of our lessons in this session, but we are still to reach there. But if you don't understand, you just need to get the idea between the compiler and the interpreter and assembler, which is the main focus of this course. Next, we have the interpreter. The interpreter is a programming language translator which translates high-level language source code into executable in a step-by-step manner. Remember the compiler we said it compiles from high level into machine language. Here for the interpreter, we also say it is from high level into machine language. The only main difference between a compiler and an interpreter is that for the compiler, it translates the whole program at the same time. Meanwhile, for an interpreter, it translates the program line by line in a way that the computer can solve one line before it translates the next line. So it is, for example, this way. With this small difference that I've given here, the interpreter translates a single line at a time and executes. Meanwhile, the compiler converts the entire program at once, producing the equivalent object code before it can run. So you can take, for example, an abstract example you can take is maybe you are discussing with someone. You say good morning in English, it needs to be translated into French. Maybe you have a friend that's doing the translation. When you give one line, good morning, your friend will need to tell the other person in the other language good morning and wait for the next sentence that you give, and you translate the next sentence. In that kind of way, we say we are dealing with an interpreter. But in the other way, you can write everything. Let's say you have written the whole conversation that you wish to do with the other person. You write everything and then you translate everything at once. All the sentences, you translate all the statements that you make at once, and you just give the other party, the other person that you are to discuss with. It is called passing through the compiler at this time. So the difference is the interpreter will be checking one line, he checks one line, interprets, executes that particular phrase before you go to the next statement. He checks the next statement, interprets, and so on. Meanwhile, the compiler checks the entire program, the whole source code, and converts it at once. Sometimes we say the interpreter is faster, sometimes the compiler is said to be faster. But the main difference is just this: the interpreter translates one line at a time, meanwhile the compiler translates the whole program at once before it runs the program. You just need to get this idea into your head as it is. This particular slide, this screen, is very important. It is what makes the difference between a compiler and an interpreter, since both of them translate from high level into low level, which is, in this case, we are talking about the machine language code. And here we are only talking about source code. Source code. What is really a source code? It is simply the set of instructions written by the programmer to instruct the computer to carry out a task or a process. So what you want the computer to accomplish, and you're giving it the commands, it means you are writing the source code. You tell the computer, read this, display this, add this, subtract this, and so on. You are writing the source code. The computer will not be able to understand the source code. You need to translate it into a way that the computer understands. And that is where the object code comes into play. Sometimes we call it object code, byte code, any other word. But the thing is just for you to write it in the source code, and it gets passed through either the compiler, the interpreter, or an assembler to have the equivalent that the computer can understand. And we call it the object code for this lesson. Some people might call it byte code. Some people can just say something closer to the machine to be able to understand. And that is just the general idea. That's just what you need to keep in mind. So to recap, a round up of this particular lesson 2 that we are dealing with, which is programming language translators. For the first one here, we have assembly and assembler versus a compiler. The main difference between the assembler and a compiler is that an assembler deals with low-level programming language, and generally this language, we say low-level programming language, we mean assembly language. There's a programming language called assembly language. So when you write your program in assembly language, you need an assembler to just translate your program into a machine language. But when you write it in a high-level programming language, you need but a compiler to be able to translate it into a low-level programming language that the machine will understand, which is the machine language. So actually with programming, the goal is for you to have this particular thing we say it is a machine language. That's the main goal in programming. You need to have this machine language. If you write something that the computer cannot understand at the end, it means you are just wasting your time. So if you are conversing with somebody that cannot understand what you are saying, you don't have a means to make the person understand, then you will just be wasting your time. That's the main issue, and that's the general idea behind all of this. You write a particular source code, but you need the computer to understand that particular source code. For you to have it in a way that the computer understands in the machine language, you need to translate it. And between the compiler and an interpreter, we have here compiler and interpreter. The main difference is just that the compiler translates a whole particular source code into the machine language source code equivalent. Meanwhile, the interpreter does it line by line. Translate line 1 executes it, translate line 2, executes it, and so on. Meanwhile, the compiler, if there are 1000 lines, it translates all the 1000 lines and run the other part that has been translated already. Meanwhile, the interpreter will check line by line. So another simple difference you can see is, let's say you are having an error with these interpreted languages that maybe is on line 50. If you are executing your program, it starts with line 1 to execute. You will execute line 1 without any issue. Line 2, line 3 till line 49. To execute line 50 now will tell you that there's an error. But meanwhile, with the compiler, it goes through the whole program in the beginning. Before even executing line 1, it checks from line 1 to line 100, the last line that you have in your program, before it will start execution. So if you have issue maybe on the last line or line 50, line 80, you will get the error before you even start running your program. That's another kind of programmer way of differentiating these two, the compiler and the interpreter. We'll continue to talk about more within the other lessons wherever necessary. But I wish to say, if you are not getting or you are not understanding any particular topic or any particular word, you can always get to us and tell us your own particular issue. And for example, last lesson I showed you IDE here and I said I'm working with Python programming language and so on. For Python, we are dealing with an interpreter. Python is an interpreted programming language, so it's translating line by line and executing. Thank you for watching. If you have any issues, you know where to drop them. You have our mail. And if you wish to follow us on our social media, we have all of these links: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, WhatsApp, and so on. But the phone number is not there. You just need to follow these other ones. And if you have any topics or any suggestions you wish us to make videos on, you can just leave them in the comment section or contact us through our email or anywhere online. All you need to do is search for PC Drills and you will find this logo. Thank you for watching. See you next time on our next video. We hope this video helped you and it will continue to provide you with such content. Bye for now.